Aloha, welcome to Global Connections here on the ThinkTech broadcast series. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and joining me today, I'm delighted to welcome a guest who's here now living in Hawaii, but she comes to us by way of Belarus, a country in Eastern Europe, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that. We're also going to talk about some other important items, things like the importance of study abroad and educational exchange, as she's a good example of that. And Marya Dzmitruk, as I'll introduce in a moment, is a good example of really the young generation we have now that are well-connected, globally connected, very savvy, crossing borders. She's had some great experiences, moved to Hawaii some years ago, and then studied at Hawaii Pacific University. She then completed some study abroad opportunities in Europe, in Belgium and in Denmark, and we're going to reflect on some of those. Because she comes from Belarus in Eastern Europe, we'll also have a chance to talk a little bit about U.S. Russian relations, and as we speak now, an important meeting that just took place in Minsk, Belarus, bringing together some leaders from Russia and Ukraine and over the crisis in Ukraine. So a lot on the table, and thank you for joining us. I'm really delighted to welcome my guest, Marya Dzmitruk. Marya, thank you, and welcome to Global Connections.
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be invited to the show, and I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you again. And for our listeners, I mean, often this term Belarus, well, what does that mean? Of course, it's an important country in Eastern Europe. Back in the bad days of the Cold War, it was just hidden inside the Soviet Union, and unless you happen to be a Sovietologist, for most people, it just wasn't on our radar. Today it is. It's an independent country now, over 25 years roughly, or just over 20 years. Tell us a little bit about Belarus, your own country, your heritage, and where you come from.
Well, I was born and raised in Minsk,
and Minsk is the capital.
And Minsk is the capital.
Yes.
Minsk has been in existence. I think recently we celebrated over 1,000 years of the birthday of the city, not the country. Yeah, like you said, Belarus was prior part of the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom, and then we had Soviet Union. Happened, so we had all of the republics join in. So Belarus was never on a table as an independent state, and when Soviet Union fell apart, we were without a government for 3 years. And in 1994, we had elections, and we got a president who established a dictatorship regime, and now we are the last dictatorship in Europe. So that is Minsk, the capital, and Belarus overall.
Yeah. Well, interesting, and you know, as you note, I mean, they had an election. Of course, we'll get a chance to talk more about that because it does remain one of the last sort of strong authoritarian regimes. It's a dictator who's been there since 1994, and very curious because, as you said, it's a very old country on the one hand, a very rich heritage, and yet in many ways it's a new country also. It's just come onto the scene now in the late 20th century. As we speak today, I mentioned earlier, we've had a marathon talks that have just produced a peace deal on the crisis in Ukraine that took place there in Minsk, and we'll speak a little bit more about that. But first, turning to yourself, you grew up there in Minsk, Belarus, and you found yourself emigrating to the U.S. as a young teenager. Tell us about that story.
It was a very difficult transition. The reason why was because I didn't speak any English. And, my mother comes home one day and she was like, yeah, Maria, pack your bags. We're going to live in America. And I was shocked because I'm like, okay, well, I know where America is. George Bush was currently the president, so I knew that. And I wasn't ready. I wasn't mentally prepared, but I was also 13. So it was a easier transition than for people who immigrate when they're older. And when I came to the States, the first city that I came to was San Diego. And everybody speaks English, and I have no idea what they're saying. And I caught on pretty quickly by watching CNN. So I think my subconscious was already telling me that I was going to go into political science. And picked up on English over the summer and went to middle school and high school in California. When I was in high school, I joined Youth Leadership Institute, and so I was kind of trying to be involved with the community, and because my passions have always been about people, bettering kids' life, youth, women, children, I mean, all of it.
So while in San Diego, you did this involvement with the youth leadership?
It was in San Francisco.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there was a lot of moving around.
Okay.
And then I graduated from high school and decided that I wanted to move out of the family house and live on my own. So I came to HBU.
here in Hawaii, you know,
yes.
quite another big jump. And maybe as a young girl growing up in Belarus, did you have Hawaii anywhere on your consciousness? Did you know about it back then, or
honestly,
not really?
I didn't. I mean, I knew about, you know, the islands that exist in the world because I learned geography in school.
Oh, okay.
But I remember when I was 5, my uncle, just for fun, decided to ask me, like, Maria, where do you want to live when you grow up? And I was like, I'm going to live in Hawaiian Islands. And I had no idea what it is, where it was, so, you know,
So
maybe...
but the seed was planted way back then,
yes.
somehow. And again, astonishing. I mean, I can just wonder, like, how many American 13-year-olds could show up in Minsk and within, you know, a very short time be fluent in Russian. It's remarkable that you were able to make this transition and effectively now find yourself as a young professional. You've graduated from the university. And tell us a little about your experience there. You made your way to Hawaii, and yet you didn't stay here too long. You quickly got on another plane and found yourself as a study abroad student. And this is critical because, you know, more and more we want to understand the world. And one of the best ways is obviously to experience it. So what did you do while you were a student here at HPU?
So I came here in fall 2010, and I quickly realized that in order to study international relations to full potential, I don't need to be here at all times. So I actually went to the study abroad office, and I told them,
Get me out of here.
Get me out of here. I need to go somewhere where
Yeah.
they have very strong international relations program.
Mhm.
And immediately they said, Brussels, Belgium, we
Brussels,
have
Belgium.
a new
Yes.
contract with the Vesalius College.
Mhm, mhm.
And I was like, all right. And I came in, and it was 3 days past the deadline to apply. But, you know, some strings were pulled, and I was able to go
Some
the
diplomatic
next
charm, and you found your way. My goodness! And so again, here you were as a young, you know, student, wanting and determined to learn about international affairs. And Brussels, of course, is in many ways the capital of the European Union and the center of so much of what's happening in European affairs. And you found yourself there as a study abroad student, in a curious way, a Belarusian that is an Eastern European, but from Hawaii, and maybe relate some stories there. You showed up in Vesalius College. It's a partner school we have in Belgium. And what was it like arriving there as an American student, although, you know, obviously Belarusian, but from Hawaii?
Well, speaking English helped a lot, you know, because that transition finally had me speaking English.
Yes.
And it was I liked the culture. Immediately, I fell in love with Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to extend my 6-month stay for a year, and I managed to do that
Yes.
through other means. And I, you know, immediately went to examine the culture of the city, you know, the history of the city, because I like to know where I'm at and who surround me. You know, met a lot of people from all over the world because, you know, Brussels is, you know, the center of the European Union. You know, all the main things happen there.
Yes.
And, you know, I met people from all over the place, and it was definitely a beneficial experience, especially being a freshman in college, to be able to absorb it so quickly rather than last minute.
Yeah. And did you have, while you were there, you took courses and all, but any other experiences, maybe getting connected with different organizations directly, or what type of work experiences?
I mostly decided to travel and study more the anthropological aspect of Belgium, like the cultures of the people, you know, the foods and the restaurants, and you know, just understanding the people rather than getting involved into the political, because I figured that I can do that through a textbook, through being in Hawaii, so I don't need to focus on it right now.
Exactly. No, and of all places, Belgium, very complex with the, you know, sort of divided nation that it is, very mixed. But I think what I find very important there, and I think it's critical for anybody who, you know, experiences other places, wants to get to know them, the importance of getting to know that place, the history, the culture, the context. And do you have any particular strategies or things that you've done? I mean, you said traveling was one, but otherwise, when you're going to new places, what are the kind of things that you do to get to know the place?
Well, I definitely go on Google. I research everything I need to know about the city, you know, if there's any, you know, the crime rate, yeah, it's a really good thing to know. Just the general rules, like how good is the transportation? Is it like Germany where everything's on time, or is it more like here in Hawaii where the bus is 30 minutes late, so I can kind of plan my trips accordingly? So there are minuscule things that make up, you know, when you put them together, they make up a big part of your stay. So just understanding the functionality of the place.
And it sounds like, I mean, a lot of it's just learning by doing. You sort of get out there and you figure it out. You figure out how to get on the bus system, and language, of course, becomes critical. And again, you have a great story having come to a new country, new language. You find yourself in Brussels where, again, depending on the part of the city, French is a widely known used language, but also it could be Dutch, depending on the part. When it comes to language, or what would you tell others who, find themselves in a remote place? Because you've got to sometimes communicate, and you may not know exactly how. And how are some ways that you've been able to overcome that?
It's been very difficult in Belgium, particularly because when I lived in Brussels, and it's mostly French speakers.
Mm-hmm.
And Brussels is unique because they speak French and Dutch, but they have a preference.
Mm-hmm.
If you go, more towards Holland, they speak Dutch, and if you go more towards France, they speak French.
Yes.
And it was very difficult to communicate with people who didn't even speak the language of the country. They didn't speak French, Dutch, or English. So you kind of start playing Jeopardy. You're doing the whole charades thing with your fingers, and you're trying to explain things. So definitely being patient, and just you have to understand that you came to a place where you're the one who can't communicate, not them. So you cannot be like, oh, you don't speak English. It's not going to work.
Yeah. No, well, and again, it's the type of thing that over time you develop those strategies, like you said, whether it's body language or very quickly figuring out, how to read something or how to get through it. Quite important, I think, especially for our young generations, to get out of the world that they know, what we call often their comfort zone. Most people tend to stay where they live, and yet we live in a world now that is increasingly more connected, right? And you've obviously, I guess, exemplified that by your own personal life experiences. Have you seen that, I guess, in this experience you've had now living in different places, that are there some common things that I guess people all share? Or do you see the world somehow coming together more, or do you see really pronounced differences that are there in different places you go?
Well, it's definitely, globalization is making its way all around the globe. And when I traveled, I've noticed that people like to stay connected with the outside. However, they do prefer to keep some identity of their own. And I found it very interesting. And the reason why is because you want to reach out to as many people and cultures and places as possible, through social media and through internet is a great invention. And at the same time, you kind of preserve your own identity with your culture, your place, and your language. And I found it to be a common thing that differentiates between regions.
And it's fascinating because, again, this process of globalization, we all live it, it does, I guess, expand a lot of common issues, and people are connected in many ways. But like you said, I think ultimately they also want to feel, what makes them distinct or unique. And I see this myself in a lot of travels where people sometimes resist this notion that we should all be homogenized and the same, and take pride more in what makes us distinct and different, whether it means preserving your language or culture or just affirming, who you are. And that becomes challenging when you have so many people, and like here you are now, a Belarusian in Hawaii who's been, educated in the U.S. and in Europe. What is your identity? You have to sort of see that it kind of gets blurry, right? Well, we'll come back and take a short break right now and return to explore some more exciting topics here. We've just touched the surface now. Joining me today, Marya Dzmitruk, who comes to Hawaii by way of Belarus, and very interesting experiences. As a young leader, you've got some great ideas now. You're embarking on a new professional career. I want to talk a little bit about that, what you see in the horizon, because we live in a world now where in many ways the cost of sort of getting connected is much lower, and you can kind of create a lot of your own, rather entrepreneurial opportunities. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges but exciting opportunities that lie ahead for you. We'll be back in just a moment with my guest, Marya Dzmitruk, exploring a range of issues, study abroad and connections around the world. But as we'll turn in a moment, what are some exciting opportunities coming ahead? So stay with us, and we'll be back with more on the story.
Hi, I'm your host on ThinkTech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, ThinkTech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Aloha, welcome. We're back and we're live, and I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, on Global Connections here at the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast series. I'm joined today by Marya Dzmitruk. Marya is a Belarusian who's emigrated from her home country there as a young teenager, grew up finishing her schooling in California, but made her way to Hawaii, where she's now finished her college experience here. And during that time, we were just relaying a great experience studying abroad in Brussels, Belgium, but also in Denmark. And tell us a little bit about that. So you had a pretty long stay in Brussels, an exciting city, capital of Europe, the European Union, that is. You then made your way just up the hill there to Denmark. What was that like?
Copenhagen's very cold. It is definitely requires a lot of layers. I found myself to be stuck up north. It's beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous scenery. You know, the people are very different from Belgium, and they're more. I found them to be more friendly, and it helped a lot because they spoke English. Most of the people who I've dealt with.
Yeah, good luck learning Danish, but they all speak English, so that helps. That's right.
So it was definitely an experience that I will remember for the rest of my life because the culture is so rich, and you have to remember Denmark that comes from Vikings, and there's all this history, and you can still see that in the people and the behavior and the communication. So it was it was a great experience.
And we were talking earlier about how the world is on one hand getting more somehow connected, and globalization does bring us together, but as well there's often I wouldn't say necessarily always a pushback, but there's a sense of saying, wait a minute, we are distinct and unique. And like you're describing Denmark, to me that's a country where, again, the people have a clear sense of who they are and what their history and culture is, how it's different, even though very similar from our perspective to Sweden or Norway or other parts of Europe, and this growing sense of identity. Who is it, and what are you? Because again, if we talk about Europe, there is this growing sort of sense of a European identity, European citizenship. You can move around more easily, you can work more easily. Nevertheless, people do go back to who it is that makes them different. And maybe if you could reflect a little bit more on this. I mean, as you see yourself over there in Europe, and people, where are you from? Well, I'm from Belarus. I mean, people, may not have clear ideas of what that means. For yourself, do you have a sense of what it means?
I actually like to think of myself as a person of a hybrid mentality because the foundation of my character was laid out in Belarus by the culture of the Belarusian people and the traditions. And then when I came to the United States, it was very difficult to sustain that without adapting. And it was the communication with people. That's what's important. And having trying to speak English, but with Belarusian mannerisms, was very complicated because it just came out very wrong. The meaning got lost, and although spoke English in translation of the body language and so on. So, in terms of identity in in Denmark, for example, or traveling all over the world, their system, whatever they have in Copenhagen, which the city where I stayed, is they're still Danes, and they still have their culture, and they still have their traditions and whatnot, but they're so open to just find out about you. So not necessarily change things about themselves, but welcome you into their culture and let you absorb it and see how you feel about it. So they're very friendly and very nice, and I think that it would be ideal if they could have it like all over the place, because you still have your own sense of who you are and where you come from, and at the same time you're open to going over the borders.
Yeah, one thing, I've been many times myself to Denmark. It always fascinates me whenever I'm in a group of mostly Danes, knowing that I'm there, they will invariably talk English, even to themselves. Almost like realizing that they don't want to sound rude or want to make sure that I'm aware of what the conversation is. And that doesn't happen in every country. Often, maybe it's the language skills are not as strong, and fortunately most Danes have good working knowledge of English. But to me, it says a lot about their character that, they realize you're there and that they have this other identity they can switch on to be, English speaking. Very interesting. And maybe for our listeners and myself as well, I'm not as familiar with Belarus. I have had a visit briefly to Ukraine, which is a neighboring country, and Belarus, big player right there in Eastern Europe, bordering Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states. Tell us a little bit about the country itself, and maybe what distinguishes it either from Russia itself, the Russian Federation, Ukraine, which of course has a lot of shared culture and heritage. How is it distinguished, and how would you describe it?
Well, the political system is very different,
Yeah,
although
yeah.
similar. It's a different regime. But in terms of people, we are distinguished by the mentality. And, you know, I'm not saying it's better or worse, it's just, it's different. I found myself traveling, you know, through Ukraine, and I've met a lot of people in Ukraine, I have family living in Ukraine. And just the work ethic, it's very different. You know, the terms of how you prioritize tasks is very different. You know, what comes first? Is it family, or is it career, or is it friends? You know, so that's the distinguishment between the Belarus and Ukraine and Russia. Belarus itself, it's a beautiful country. It has one of the most expensive visitor visas. So when you give a chance,
Yeah.
Go ahead and visit.
So you have to pay the dictatorship to go in and see it.
Yes, I believe last year the visa cost was like 500 euros, and they
that's
expect to
pretty stiff.
have, you know, fresh, crisp bills. Yes.
And that doesn't count the extra 100 you slip under to get it moving a little faster.
Tax is not included.
Oh, well, very interesting. And of course, one thing that's fascinating is it is in the news today. Minsk has been the site of a negotiation that's been unfolding right now between Russia and Ukraine over the crisis there in eastern Ukraine. And I was curious, you know, again, as a follower yourself of international affairs, I mean, you know, Minsk, now they're not directly involved in this crisis, although it's in their neighborhood, but why would we see, or what would you speak to? I mean, why is this happening in Minsk? Is it more of a sort of a neutral territory of sorts, or is it like a halfway point bringing Ukraine and Russia together, or is it like a cousin that's hosting it? I mean, how would you describe the fact that Minsk is basically the site of this, you know, negotiation that has just occurred?
Well, Belarus is like a buffer zone
Okay.
between, you know, Russia and the EU, where they have NATO and whatnot. So it makes sense why they all came to meet in Minsk.
Yeah.
It's also, I don't believe that there's any political strategy involved in this, but just rather, you know, neutral territory. But Belarus is still a card that Russia tends to play. So I don't think they had much choice whether to host it or not.
So it was a way of somehow having a place that was not Russia, but, you know, somehow close enough, and yet, like you said, a buffer zone in between. And, you know, this is a crisis that we've now seen on, you know, in the headlines quite substantially this past year. The crisis in Ukraine I'm referring to, initially the annexation of Crimea, but actually since then now, you've got this unfolding, you know, continuing crisis in eastern Ukraine with what we're understood to be Russian-supported rebels that are fighting against the Ukrainian government. I mean, tell us a little bit about the context from your perspective as, you know, as an Eastern European. I mean, what is at the root of the conflict itself, and what are some of the either challenges or scenarios that we could see play out?
Well, to start off, I believe that the root of the conflict is from Ukrainian people themselves. Because when you look at Ukraine, the western part speaks the Ukrainian language, and the eastern part is the one that speaks Russian. So Crimea was prior territory of Russia. So during the Russian Empire, and when the Soviet Union came to be for an anniversary, leader gave it to Ukraine, because never had he thought that Ukraine, you know, Soviet Union fall apart.
That's right.
And as I was saying.
So some of it is the natural divide already. You've got a portion of the population that's very much more Ukrainian, maybe more focused in their worldview towards the West.
And just like I mentioned earlier, you know, the different mentality, the people who are living in eastern Ukraine, you know, they're the Russian-speaking people. Of course, they've mingled throughout, you know, years, and it's like Russian Ukrainians, but the majority is Russians and Tatars and whatnot. And they, you know, they would like to go back and join Russia because the mentality of the two differs. So the Ukrainian people who speak Ukrainian, they'd like to go and join the EU, but all of the industrial you know, functions are in the eastern eastern part, and you know, they don't want to go. So the country started pulling itself apart, and then Russia came in and it's like, okay, I'm going to take what's mine. And of course, that causes lots of political issues.
So in some ways, at the end of the day, it really is an issue of identity and what people kind of, where they feel being pulled one way or the other, and a sense that perhaps those Ukrainian speakers from the West are somehow not allowing them to be, you know, as connected to Russia, or as, you know, express their Russian identities in a way. You know, as we look at crisis and conflicts around the world these days, since the end of the Cold War, we see more of the power of ethnic conflict being at the root of it. And yet, it is more complex. It's not that simple. I mean, some of it is, as you described, even the economic, because a lot of the industry based in the East, of course, is the engine of growth for the economy. And, you know, I would guess that there's a concern about splitting that up or, you know, dividing it in two. It's not that simple. Very interesting. Now, one of the things that I wanted to turn to in a moment, and you've now, you know, you've finished your college experience recently, and you've got some new ideas you're bubbling with. Particularly, I know you've shared with me, and I wanted to see if you could kind of tell us a little bit more about this. Ideas of there's a critical need maybe for, you know, better understanding, analysis of foreign affairs, and the idea of developing a think tank of sorts, and maybe particularly one that looks more at harnessing social media and connecting, you know, youth perspectives. I think that becomes so critical because too often a lot of what takes place, even like these meetings in Ukraine, they're usually old people that are, you know, negotiating, usually with a very, you know, set way. And at the end of the day, when we can bring together young people, they often have a way of looking at things in a, you know, somehow a better, different perspective. So share with us some of your ideas. What have you been thinking about now, and you know, where you're going to be going?
To relate it to, you know, what we just talked about U.S. Russia and Ukraine situation, there's a lot of media speculation. I mean, anything and everything goes out on the internet, and it's so easy to find information, but the question is, how accurate is it? So my idea has been, you know, utilizing the sources of being able to reach anybody at any point in the world, as long as they have Wi-Fi and internet connection, reach them and be able to just tell the news how they are, to, you know, analyze situations how they are, rather than, you know, picking a side and trying to speculate, you know, video footage or news information, or, you know, how the meetings go, because, you know, what happens and what comes out into the media are two very different events. So I'm just trying to, you know, I get fed up of trying to find truthful information. So I decided that I'm just going to make truthful information of my own. I'm going to, but my idea is to create a think tank and utilize sources such as, you know, junior, senior students from political science majors, and see what their interests are. And if they want to talk about, you know, India and how India is doing today, then they can do research on that. And it's going to be, you know, first of all, it allows for them to, you know, kind of step into the world of, you know, doing an internship, and that, you know, while they're studying, they have an ability to, you know, expand their resume. And at the same time, they can, you know, see what the real life is like, you know, by doing this research and, you know, writing these articles and, you know, getting them published. And, you know, who knows, potentially we might have policymakers look at it, or, you know, domestic and international. So so
in many ways, giving a voice to, you know, many of the young populations, and it is an important opportunity. It's also, I would say, a challenge. You know, as you know, we have in general a lot of what we might call apathy, people who aren't interested in, you know, what's happening because it's complicated, or disconnected, because too often, particularly even in our democratic systems, if we call them that, the leadership seems to be listening really more to those who either have more influence, more money, more experience. And the voice of, let's say, the youth is not always there, but it's important to understand, especially a lot of, I mean, I know this is very true in a lot of the dialogue about Northeast Asia, for example, Korea. We have in many ways a lot of people who've been dealing with this issue for decades, and they seem to be like frozen in a Cold War mentality. When you bring together young groups of Americans, Japanese, Koreans, like youth, people in their 20s and 30s, they often bring a very different perspective to this. It's like, why are we, you know, stuck in this mindset? And I think what you're getting at is a need to really break through, have a dialogue from younger perspectives, and what do you see as some of the challenges? I mean, it's one thing to do that and get it together, but then how do you make that impact policy or reach, you know, decision makers in some way? Any thoughts about how that can come about?
Well, that's where the studying abroad while you're in college comes in handy, because whilst you're studying abroad, you're able to create connections with people and professors. And, you know, once you're doing this kind of work where you're writing, researching and writing up articles, you can send it out to them. So I can actually send some of my work to people that I've met in Denmark, or people that I've met in Belgium, or, you know, my friends and family in Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus, you know, and they can utilize that information and kind of pass it on. So they just take the product that's ready and see who's interested in taking it. So it's not necessarily something that's going to be, you know, the next big thing, but it's definitely, you know, these thoughts that are, you know, edited in, you know, proper grammar in English, and possibly available translations depending on what they are. And I do strongly believe that, you know, kids my age, you know, in their 20s, 30s, are able to generate ideas better. And the reason why is because they don't have a lot of experience. And just having that fresh mind that's not clogged by, you know, the, well, historical events that, you know, all these people that are like in their 70s and 80s tend to talk about, you know, of course, you've gained wisdom, you have experience, but we have the ability to be naive and believe that something new can work and come up with that new idea. And, you know.
And I think what's exciting, again, part of our globalized world is that the costs of you know, basically doing this have come now down quite a bit. It's not that difficult to get connected, get involved, and through whether it's use of social media, the internet itself has really facilitated this ability to have conversations across vast borders. And so it is, I think, the future we're going to be dealing with now. So no longer are we confined to just these little small, you know, hubs of expertise, but instead crossing borders. And I commend you for that, and certainly encourage you to keep going at it, because it is the future. The future is here now. Very interesting topics, and what I want to do is take another short break as we'll continue our conversation in a moment, but remind our listeners we're joined here by Marya Dzmitruk. She's a young leader who's basically, you know, began her life in Minsk, Belarus, found her way to Hawaii, has studied abroad in parts of Europe, and is now really, you know, looking at some great opportunities for how to, you know, build from that experience, and really underscoring the importance of international educational exchange and language learning, international affairs. I do hope you stay tuned and come back and join us here for more on the conversation on Global Connections. Aloha.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevelin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday.
Do to help prepare themselves for those next steps. I mean, you talked about getting involved with either internships or clubs and the like. Okay, well, thank you and welcome back. I'm sorry, we're joined here by my guest, Marya Dzmitruk, on Global Connections, and having a great conversation. We're really understanding really the importance of study abroad. And of course, if I had my druthers as an educator, I would require everybody, but that's not the world we're in. Unfortunately, we have to encourage, and those like yourself who really understand the importance of it. If you could maybe tell us a little bit, you know, having done this study abroad yourself, you've spent a long time in Belgium and also in Denmark. I mean, why is this important, and what would you say to young, you know, students who are either getting ready to go to college or maybe in college now?
Well, it's definitely important to, you know, leave the house, leave your comfort zone, and go explore. So whether you're coming to university from another state or from another city where you don't live at home, what I mean is, you know, leave the country and go experience the world. And it will really help because you're able to better connect with people. Even when you come back home after having this experience, your perception of things changes. You're not ethnocentric anymore. Whether you like it or not, you're more open-minded. And some experiences that I would recommend for current college students or prospective college students to you know, get involved with is when you're studying in a university, it is crucially important to get involved with, you know, your university clubs. There's plenty in every single school. And if there's no club of your liking, you can make up your own club. Get involved with internships to better understand if what you're studying is what you want to do. And the earlier you do it, it's the better. Yes. You know, if there's no internships, look for externships. Look for places to volunteer. And you know, I'm not saying go get a good, well-paying job while you're in school. If you can do that, that's amazing. But definitely try and get a feel of the field while you're still in school, because while you're in school, you can still change your major if you decided that you're wearing the wrong pair of shoes.
Well put, and I think it's critical. One of these things, again, you've drawn on your own experience, and you were quite early on recognizing these important things. Some students takes a little time, and not everybody figures that out. But when I hear you describe that, to me, it's the idea that the learning that you have, particularly at the university level, isn't just out of the classroom experience, the textbook. It's really what you do outside of the classroom as well. And you could say the same about life in general. I mean, many of us go on to have, you know, a particular job or career, but in many ways we also have a fuller life than that. You might be involved in voluntary organizations, and here in the U.S. this is a very common thing. We have involvement in many civic clubs or social groups, but likewise in your educational experience, what you've described is the need to really test the waters, get out there, and you meet people with similar interests, but you meet people who might help open other doors, right? And can you give any examples? I mean, things that you tried that you didn't realize and suddenly it led to something else, or it opened a different door?
You know, I realized that I had 4 years to network. And what I did was I spent 4 years studying and, you know, filling up my backpack with knowledge and information, whether I acquired it in a classroom or outside of the classroom. What's important is the reason why I would want students to get involved with other things other than education in the university, in the facility, is establishing those connections, because you may not have, you know, a person that you meet offer you a job, but they can guide you after your graduation to, you know, to other outlets, to other sources to help you get your foot in the door, because the most difficult thing has been actually getting through, you know, walking out of the graduation ceremony and realizing this is the real life. You know, now you have to work really hard to, you know, get in, and it's very complicated if you don't already have established network.
Yes, no, and so it is that critical, you know, the connections that you develop, and beyond that, also the kind of skills. And I mean, I see you reflecting it in many ways, but as you think back right now, I mean, what are the kind of skills that you think are so critical for surviving in this new world? And I mean, part of it is understanding, you know, technologies and media. I mean, if you are not able to connect to the world through the computers, you know, you'll have a very different world. But beyond that, what kind of skills and qualities and maybe competencies would you say are necessary for our young, you know, young generation to develop?
Well, definitely being open-minded, you know, allowing yourself to take things in and, you know, kind of filter it through and go from there. If you're not open-minded, it's really difficult to continue on in life, because we are evolving very quickly. This is a new generation, and we have so many things at our disposal, like, you know, the social media and just access to, you know, the World Wide Web, where you can reach anybody, anywhere, practically, and just having the ability to open up your mind and go and trying to communicate with people who come from different places allows you to better work in your own country. Not necessarily because you can work with people, your neighbor, but you'll be able to communicate more efficiently with them. So the two things that I can't stress enough is, you know, open-mindedness and communication, effective communication.
No, excellent, and very well put. And of course, one thing I always see happen, but also remind our, you know, my own students, when you go to another place to study, particularly to study abroad, not only do you learn about that place, which you do and you should learn the history, the culture, the language, and so on, but it also then forces you to rethink your own values and your own home, and why do we do things that way? Or maybe you either appreciate the things that you miss or don't have, or you begin to rethink maybe that thing you thought was important, not quite as important as you thought it was. So it makes you think not just about that place, but your own values, your own home. Do you find yourself seeing that too? I mean, again, where you're from kind of depends, because while you left your home country of Belarus, you've become, you know, Americanized and so on. And even while you're in Europe, did you see yourself either missing anything from back in Hawaii or otherwise, I don't know, since you've been in the U.S., things you miss from Belarus?
Well, it was very difficult to spread aloha in Belgium. But I believe that, you know, when you learn about new cultures and new places, and you take the opportunity to travel and see those places, of course things change. Of course you start to rethink, you know, how have I been living all this time? And it doesn't strip you of your identity, but it allows for you to better yourself, because then you see what works and what doesn't, and if it works, where does it work, and if it doesn't work, where it doesn't work, and how to approach it and, you know, fix it.
Yeah, no, very well put. And again, these are things that, gosh, some people take a whole lifetime to learn. You're basically a young woman and, you know, still in your early 20s, and you've figured a lot of these out, so I really commend you for that. It is a great example, again, of the world that we live in, that, you know, we really need to get out there, like you said, get out of your comfort zone and see the world, travel. You also have to stumble along the way, and, you know, I certainly agree the open-mindedness, and that comes from these experiences. I often like to say that another thing you need is a sense of humor. You have to be able to laugh at yourself, or when you see situations that just might cause some people to cry, you have to be able to laugh a little bit because you will go on. So a sense of humor doesn't hurt. The other thoughts, I guess, that come to my mind, you've described communication skills, so critical. And some of that, some people have them and some people have to learn them, and whether it's written, whether it's oral. And we say communication, but sometimes the key to communication is being a good listener. And I wonder if you ever had experiences where you realize you just have to sometimes stop and observe and listen and kind of draw in, whereas other times you have to step in and say something. I mean, what would you say about that?
Well, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So it means you have to listen more and talk less. Of course, listening to people is essential because it allows for you to, first of all, understand what they're talking about, you receive the information, analyze it, and then speak. Because if we don't listen to people or don't spend more time listening, we miss out a lot of, the hidden messages that are in the communication. We miss out the body language. We don't pay attention to crucial details that make up, the whole story. So if you don't listen, you only are left with 30% of the information.
Very good.
And it's not an accurate number, but that's okay.
Very well put. And again, your own exposure and your experiences in these different places, I mean, you obviously see people do communicate very differently, and we often either describe it as a more direct or indirect, more subtle, even the notion of body language that you've described. Here in Hawaii, we've got many different peoples from different cultures, and yet it's come together to create our own particular way of communicating. And I'm curious, maybe as we finish our conversation today, now you've been both lived in Hawaii many years, but you've gone away and you've come back. When you think about this place, what are the kind of things that you I guess either take away that you could describe to others when people say, well, what's it like in Hawaii? Because we have this diversity on one hand of people, which can be exciting, but it can also be sometimes frustrating. And how do you describe our own culture here?
The first thing that I always say is that people are so open and so friendly. And of course, not everybody, there's exceptions. But for the most part, I found Hawaii to be very different from mainland and very different from the rest of the world. I haven't traveled to Asia yet, but I've noticed that, Western, Eastern Europe, it's a significant difference. It's almost like black and white. Because Hawaiians are open and they're welcoming, and where you go to other places and people are more introverted, and they don't smile at you, they don't say hi, how are you? And here in Hawaii they say aloha, and it's amazing.
And so you take that away, and again, it's a good example of, I think, part of the generosity that people have here, and we often describe it as a place that's always been welcome to outsiders. It can also go both ways, because when people come here and have a desire to want to change everything or do things differently, that often gets pushed back. Wait, we're just fine. We don't have to do everything differently. And so it's maybe some describe it as a place that doesn't adapt well to a lot of change. We like it the way it is. Don't push it. Whereas some other cultures sometimes are constantly in change and maybe harder to define. Well, it's been a great opportunity, Marya, to learn more about your background, your interests, and as a young woman who's made your way from Eastern Europe all the way to the other side of the planet. Little did you know, as a young 5-year-old, was it an uncle who mentioned the Hawaiian Islands, that you would find yourself here as a permanent resident and now a young professional, making your way and looking at how these communications technologies today allow you to, even though you be here, you've now got connections all over the world that you continue with, and I'm sure you will be able to return in a future time to tell us more about your next steps. I want to wish you well as you embark on these new opportunities. And for our listeners, just again, underscore global connections. That's what it's about. We've brought a great guest that's joined us today, Marya Dzmitruk, and she's a testament to really how important it is to see the world, get out of your comfort zone, and get to know other people and places. And I thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you.
For our listeners, stay tuned and join us again for another of our Global Connections show here on ThinkTech Hawaii. And thank you for joining us today. Aloha.